Have you ever watched your own mother physically rip your face out of a family portrait? No. So imagine this. You are at your parents' 40th anniversary gala in San Francisco. 100 guests and local elites are all watching the main stage. Your golden child brother just premiered a glowing family documentary. And you, their own daughter, are erased from existence in every single frame. They clapped expecting me to quietly leave in shame. Instead, as a professional video archivist, I calmly plugged my laptop into the main projector. I hit play on a silent, undeniable supercut of my mother's abuse, projected on a 10-foot screen. Before I tell you what happened when the room went dead silent, tell me how old you are right now in the comments, and welcome back to my channel, where the truth always finds a way out. My name is Emma Greta. I am 34 years old, and I preserve history for a living. Working as a video archivist for a historical society in San Francisco taught me that people lie but raw footage does not. I restore old film, digitize fading tapes, and catalog the fragile moments people capture before they realize they are being watched. For a decade I operated under a quiet and fatal delusion. I believed that making myself useful was the exact same thing as being loved. Tonight that delusion was dying in the audiovisual booth of the Fairmont Hotel. I knelt on the carpet, securing a stray cable with tape. Below me, the ballroom hummed with the steady polished murmur of old money and new ambition. The soft clinking of crystal champagne glasses echoed against the high ceilings. At the center of the room, Sylvia stood upright facing the camera flashes of the event photographers, looking directly forward with a practiced smile. The heavy silk of her tailored emerald gown rustled as she moved. She was a mid-tier real estate developer, trying to pivot into a higher tax bracket. Her current targets were conservative investment firm partners who valued traditional, cohesive family brands. I did not fit that brand. I worked in the public sector, bought my clothes off the rack, and eloped with my husband David at City Hall on a rainy Tuesday. 3 weeks prior, my brother Julian had arrived at our apartment. Julian was a struggling filmmaker whose primary talent was securing funding from our parents for projects that rarely saw the light of day. He sat at my kitchen island while a heavy storm beat against the windows. The rain lashed the glass, masking the tense silence in the room. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair and let out a long, heavy sigh. He slid a blank hard drive across the marble counter. I had spent 6 years restoring our childhood home movies' color, correcting faded holiday trips, and repairing fragile film reels. He needed them for a documentary tribute for the anniversary gala. David stood by the sink drying a coffee mug. The rhythmic squeak of the dish towel stopped. I could hear David exhale a sharp breath of disapproval. He knew my blind spot. I wanted to believe my brother finally respected my craft. I wanted to contribute. I handed Julian the encrypted hard drive, offering up a decade of my labor. Julian snatched the device quickly, as if terrified I might change my mind. His tense shoulders finally dropped from their rigid defensive posture, and he walked out the door without a single word of thanks. Now brushing dust off my knees in the Fairmont AV booth, the reality of my usefulness was coming into focus. When I arrived at the venue 2 hours earlier, the steady hum of the hotel air conditioning had been the only sound in the empty ballroom. I had checked the master seating chart on the coordinator's tablet. The investor tables were front and center. The extended relatives occupied the wings. My name was absent. I found Julian pacing near the service elevators. His dress shoes tapped a frantic, anxious rhythm against the marble floor. When I approached him, he avoided my eyes entirely. He shoved a silver flash drive and a printed audiovisual schedule into my chest. He claimed his editor had just finished rendering the final cut 5 minutes ago, leaving absolutely no time for a preview run. He gestured toward the investors in the next room, rubbing his temples and shaking his head. He needed a technician to plug and play without asking questions, so I became the technician. David stepped in front of me in the hallway, subtly shifting his shoulders to physically block my line of sight to Julian. His grip on my arm was firm and grounding, pulling me out of the line of fire. He tilted his head toward the exit doors, silently asking me to leave with him. But the habit of compliance is a thick rope. I convinced myself I was holding the high ground by staying. I set up my laptop console in the shadows at the back of the room, isolating myself from the laughter and the music. I watched Sylvia shake hands with the venture capitalists, projecting the image of a flawless matriarch. I watched Julian step up to the stage. I tapped the spacebar on my laptop to test the feed, listening to the low mechanical whir of the projector overhead, unaware that I had just finished digging the foundation for my own public erasure. The ballroom lights dimmed to a low amber glow as the heavy velvet curtains shifted. The ambient murmur of 100 guests faded into a quiet, expectant hush. From my position in the elevated audiovisual booth, I pressed the smooth plastic key on my laptop to begin the playback. The heavy mechanical whir of the projector overhead filled the tight space. A beam of stark white light pierced the darkness and hit the massive screen above the center stage. My brother had named his project The Foundation of Us. The opening frame faded in, and the familiar grainy texture of 8mm film washed over the room. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool metal of the console, listening to the soft, static hiss of the original audio track. The first clip flickered to life. It was Christmas from over 2 decades ago. The speakers pumped out the crisp sound of tearing wrapping paper and the crackle of a burning fireplace. My father, Richard Greta, appeared on the screen. He was a man approaching his 60s, but looked younger in the old footage. He was standing upright, facing the camera, and looking directly forward with a stiff, formal posture. The lens panned across the living room, capturing the towering pine tree and the mountains of gifts. A cold, heavy realization began to settle in my chest as the scene continued. I knew this footage intimately. I had spent weeks restoring the color balance on this exact reel. I knew that I was sitting on the rug, just to the right of the fireplace, wearing a red sweater. But the image on the 10-foot screen jumped abruptly. The framing shifted inward. The edge of the picture cut off right where my shoulder should have been. I was gone. The documentary transitioned to a family trip to Lake Tahoe. The audio track filled the ballroom with the sharp howl of winter wind and the heavy crunch of boots stepping through deep snow. I remembered the biting cold of that afternoon and the way my hands froze inside thin gloves. The restored film showed Julian building a snow fort while my mother supervised. In the original version, I was standing beside them, handing Julian blocks of ice. In the version playing before the silent audience, the aspect ratio had been cropped so tightly that only Julian and my mother remained in the frame. The visual amputation was precise and methodical. My breath caught in my throat as the scenes kept changing. The rhythm of the erasure became undeniable. During the footage of my parents' vow renewals, the sound of clapping and polite laughter echoed from the speakers. I remembered wearing an uncomfortable floral dress and standing next to my mother during the ceremony. On the screen, just as the camera swung toward my position, Sylvia physically stepped forward, blocking the lens with her body. My existence was meticulously scrubbed from every frame. The audio narration, recorded by Julian, reverberated through the high ceilings of the ballroom. His voice was smooth and confident, painting a picture of an isolated, tight-knit trio. The pacing of his narration left no room for a sister. He projected the narrative of a successful only child carrying the weight of his parents' legacy. The guests sat in rapt attention, drinking in the curated illusion. The gentle clinking of silverware against china provided a steady rhythm to the unfolding deception. My hands gripped the edge of the table. The plastic edge dug into my palms. I had spent countless nights alone in my apartment, carefully preserving these memories. I had repaired torn spools and rescued fading colors because I believed archiving our shared history would secure my place within it. Watching the altered film play to a room of strangers, I understood the depth of my mistake. My labor had not secured my belonging. My labor had provided them the raw materials to construct my absence. The film ended with a fade to black. The speakers went silent for a fraction of a second before the ballroom erupted. The thunderous sound of 100 people clapping and cheering shook the floorboards. The sudden noise hit me like a physical force. The lights flared back to full brightness, shining harshly against the dark velvet walls. I packed my laptop and zipped my bag. The heavy thud of the zipper closing felt final. I left the booth and walked down the back corridor before stopping at the base of the service staircase. The heavy thump of the bass from the reception music bled through the walls. I saw Julian standing on the landing above me. I gripped the wooden handrail and began walking from the bottom step, moving upward to the top landing to face him. He did not look like a triumphant artist. His shoulders were slumped, and he wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His breathing was ragged and shallow. When I reached the top step, he shrank back against the patterned wallpaper. He glanced nervously toward the heavy double doors leading to the main reception. He offered no victorious sneer. He pressed his palms together in a gesture of desperate pleading. His chest heaved with anxious sighs. He pointed toward the room full of investors, and then pointed at my plain clothes, making frantic pushing motions with his hands. He was silently begging me not to cause a disruption. He was attempting to convey that my exclusion was merely a business calculation. Sylvia approached the landing. The rustle of her heavy silk gown preceded her. She offered a tight, rigid smile that did not reach her eyes. She reached out and patted my arm with quick, dismissive taps. Her eyes remained perfectly cold and unblinking, betraying absolutely no remorse. She gestured toward the audio-visual equipment, indicating her supposed gratitude for my technical assistance behind the scenes. Her posture demanded compliance. She pointed back toward the ballroom, projecting the idea that this fabrication was necessary for the survival of the family portfolio. My immediate instinct was to turn around and flee. I wanted to run to my car and let the tears fall in the safety of the dark. I took a step back toward the stairs. David appeared beside me. He gently touched my arm, wrapping his fingers around my wrist. His steady, rhythmic breathing grounded me. He tugged softly toward the exit, offering a silent invitation to walk away from the toxicity. I looked at the heavy double doors. I listened to the muffled laughter and the upbeat jazz music spilling out from the celebration inside. Running away was my default reaction. It was the pattern I had followed my entire adult life. But standing on that landing, listening to the mechanical hum of the hotel ventilation system, a new clarity washed over me. Fleeing was exactly what they expected. Retreating into the shadows was the very mechanism that allowed them to weaponize my labor. If I walked down those stairs, I would be accepting my own erasure. I let out a long, slow breath. I planted my feet firmly on the carpet. I refused to move. I pulled my wrist from David's gentle grip. The fabric of my sleeve slipped softly through his fingers. I turned my back on the exit doors. The thick hotel carpeting absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I moved away from the quiet stairwell and headed back toward the shadows of the audio-visual booth. The rhythmic thumping of the upright bass from the jazz band vibrated upward through the floorboards. The air in the upper mezzanine smelled faintly of roasted meats and expensive floral perfumes. I climbed the short set of carpeted steps leading into the control area. The entrance to the technical space was narrow. A hotel audiovisual technician stood squarely in the doorway. He crossed his arms over his dark uniform shirt. His posture was rigid and unyielding. He shook his head from side to side, physically blocking the path to the primary console. He pointed a finger toward the main presentation system and then tapped the laminated security badge clipped to his belt. He was enforcing the strict venue lockout protocol. My heart beat a steady, rapid rhythm against my ribs. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my phone. The screen cast a pale blue light across the dim hallway. I reached into my bag and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. I folded them once and pressed them firmly against his chest, directly over his venue name tag. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him a single sharp nod. He glanced down at the cash, then looked back at my expressionless face. He did not ask any questions. He casually slipped the bills into his dark uniform pocket, tapped his communication earpiece feigning a radio call, and stepped out of the doorway. I slid into the ergonomic chair behind the primary control board and bypassed the standard venue interface with a series of swift practiced keystrokes. The encrypted hard drive rested on the desk. A tiny white indicator light pulsed steadily on its metallic casing. Inside that metal shell lay terabytes of unedited history. When I originally digitized the family archives, I spent late nights sitting in my living room, listening to the heavy rain drum against the window glass. The smell of old celluloid and dust always filled my workspace. I categorized every discarded snippet of film. I saved the outtakes. I preserved the moments the camera kept rolling after the staged smiles faded. I did not have a polished retaliation video prepared for this exact moment. Real life lacks a perfectly timed musical score or a cinematic montage. I only had raw data. I navigated through the directory and opened the unedited folders. Down on the ballroom floor, Sylvia walked to the microphone under a stark white spotlight. She bowed her head, wiped an invisible tear from her cheek, and placed her hand over her heart. She was selling a flawless maternal image to the investors. She did not know my fingers were already hovering over the manual display override. I routed the raw video feed directly to the main projector and pressed enter. The execution was fast and absolute. The 10-foot screen directly behind Sylvia flared to life. The polished corporate logo of her real estate firm vanished. A shaky, grainy projection took its place. There was no accompanying audio track. There was no dramatic music swelling in the background. Just the stark visual reality, casting flickering shadows over Sylvia as she continued her pantomime of a heartfelt speech. The first clip displayed a sunny afternoon in a suburban backyard. The wind whipped through the trees, tossing leaves across the green grass. A much younger Julian stood in the center of the frame. His small chest heaved with silent sobs. Tears streamed down his face. Sylvia marched into the shot. Her face was contorted into sharp, harsh angles. She pointed a finger at the camera lens and then grabbed Julian's shoulders, giving him a hard, rigid shake. She pointed at his face, demanding a performance. The contrast between her current serene posture at the podium and the visual evidence of her cruelty was jarring. The projection transitioned seamlessly to a high school graduation. I appeared on the screen wearing a dark cap and gown. I was attempting to stand next to my father for a portrait. Sylvia strode into the frame with determined steps. She planted her hand firmly on my arm and shoved me backward. The force of the push sent me stumbling out of the picture. She then adjusted her hair and smiled a broad artificial grin for the photographer. The sheer physical hostility of the act played out in a silent, continuous loop. The final piece of footage flickered onto the massive screen. It was an indoor scene, capturing the aftermath of a failed audit. Richard Greta, my father, stood frozen near his home office desk. Sylvia paced aggressively, kicking a heavy leather chair across the room. She waved a stack of financial notices in his face. Her mouth moved in rapid biting shapes as she openly mocked the exact same investors she was currently trying to woo outside. She aggressively shoved my father against the bookshelf, knocking over a row of framed awards. It was not just family dysfunction. It was raw, unhinged volatility from a woman, demanding millions in capital. The ballroom atmosphere shifted violently. The soft murmurs evaporated into a suffocating, heavy silence. The crowd stared at the towering display as the unvarnished truth of Sylvia's abuse washed over them in high definition. The investors stiffened, sensing a massive liability. Sylvia continued her fake, heartfelt pantomime for a few excruciating seconds, completely oblivious to the damning history playing out behind her. Then she noticed the horrified stares of the front row. Sylvia slowly twisted her torso toward the towering projection. The color instantly drained from her face. A sharp gasp echoed through the main sound system as she dropped the microphone. The dull, heavy thud of the device hitting the wooden podium reverberated across the vast space. Her manicured hands gripped the edges of the stand as the carefully constructed public image she had spent decades building fractured in seconds in front of 100 silent witnesses. A ripple of physical discomfort spread through the audience. The rhythmic scraping of wooden chairs pushing back against the thick hotel carpet filled the void. The sharp clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased entirely as guests lowered their drinks to the linen-covered tables. The low, uneasy shifting of bodies and the clearing of throats replaced the polite murmurs of the elite crowd. The investors in the front rows stiffened their postures, their expressions hardening into masks of professional distance. The sound of a heavy silver fork dropping onto a porcelain plate echoed like a falling stone. The frantic thud of dress shoes echoed loudly as Julian sprinted from the bottom floor, moving rapidly upward to reach the elevated landing of the technical booth. His erratic, heavy breathing grew louder with each step he took toward the narrow doorway. He burst into the small, dark space with a desperate rush of air. His chest heaved with deep, panicked sighs. He reached over the console and grabbed the thick black cable connecting the laptop to the venue system. The violent metallic scrape of the cord being yanked from the port sliced through the quiet hum of the room. A sudden digital pop cracked through the overhead speakers. The bright beam of the projector snapped off, leaving the massive screen stark white for a fraction of a second, before plunging into a deep, empty black. The internal cooling fans of the machine wound down with a slow, fading mechanical whine. The damage to their narrative was irreversible. I sat in the ergonomic chair and took a long, steady breath, pulling the cool air deep into my lungs. I closed my laptop, slid it into my carrying bag, and gathered my cables with measured, deliberate motions. There was no rushing and no trembling. I secured the strap over my shoulder and walked out of the booth. I walked out of the booth and descended the carpeted stairs. My low heels clicked an even rhythmic pace against the floorboards. As I stepped past the heavy velvet curtains and entered the main reception area, the atmosphere felt thick and unbreathable. There was no triumphant applause waiting for me. The space was heavy with a deep, awkward tension. The guests parted, forming a narrow path toward the exit doors. The rustle of expensive fabrics surrounded me as extended relatives physically turned their backs. The harsh hissing sound of their loud whispers drifted through the air, mimicking the noise of dry leaves scattering across pavement. They shook their heads and let out sharp, disappointed sighs, expressing their unified judgment of my bitter jealousy. I continued walking down the long center aisle. The scent of roasted meats and fading floral centerpieces lingered in the stale air. I approached table 4 where my father Richard sat. His posture remained upright and stiff, but he faced the opposite direction. He kept his gaze locked onto the white linen tablecloth, refusing to lift his head as my footsteps approached. The dull scrape of his water glass sliding an inch across the table was the only movement he made. His slow, defeated exhales signaled his final refusal to acknowledge my presence. He had enabled the abuse for decades through his quiet compliance, and he chose that same quiet compliance now. Near the front of the room, the conservative, risk-averse investors began their departure. They were looking for a stable, traditional family brand to back, but instead they had just witnessed a violent, unpredictable liability. The decisive, heavy thumps of briefcases snapping shut signaled the collapse of the real estate partnership. The firm, purposeful strides of the executives moving toward the coat check cut through the lingering tension. The fading echo of their footsteps represented the deal dissolving into nothing. Sylvia remained frozen at the podium, watching the exodus with wide, unblinking eyes, as the capital she desperately needed walked out the door. Julian stood near the service doors, blocking the path to the lobby. His face was flushed red, and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He pointed an accusing finger in my direction, letting out a sharp, disgusted scoff. He threw his hands up in the air, his palms slapping loudly against his sides in frustration. His deep, angry groans carried the full weight of his blame. He held me permanently responsible for humiliating him in front of his peers. I did not break my stride. I stepped around him, leaving his heavy sighs echoing in the corridor. David stepped out of the shadows near the grand entrance. He deliberately positioned himself squarely between me and the glaring eyes of my extended family, shielding me from their judgment. The warmth of his hand wrapped securely around my fingers. He threw one final icy glare toward Julian, warning him to stay back, before pushing open the heavy brass doors of the Fairmont Hotel, allowing the sudden rush of the cold outside air to hit our faces. The thick gray San Francisco fog rolled through the streets, carrying the damp, salty smell of the bay. The low, distant moan of a foghorn sounded through the thick marine layer. We walked to the parking garage in a heavy shared quiet. The crisp click of the car unlocking and the solid thud of the heavy doors shutting sealed us inside the small dark space. The engine turned over with a low, reliable hum. We drove through the winding city streets toward our small apartment. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers swept away the fine, misty drizzle gathering on the glass. The tires hummed a wet, continuous song as they glided over the slick, dark asphalt. David kept his right hand firmly over mine on the center console. His thumb rubbed slow, comforting circles against my skin. He did not ask if I was okay or offer hollow reassurances, simply letting his silent, reliable presence anchor me in the dark. I looked out the passenger window, watching the blurred, glowing halos of the streetlights passing by in the fog. A deep physical ache settled in the center of my chest. The hollow, throbbing pain of amputating a bloodline pressed down on my shoulders. I had severed the only family connection I possessed, leaving a vast, empty space where my hope for belonging used to reside. The cost of drawing the boundary was steep and isolating. I listened to the soft patter of the rain hitting the metal roof of the car and the steady rush of the wind rushing past the windows. The profound quiet inside the vehicle carried no expectations and no carefully crafted lies. As the neon signs and traffic signals melted into streaks of color outside, I realized that the silence surrounding us was finally honest, unedited, and entirely mine.